The Thames is a filthy beast. Down to a sunless sea. A story by Neil Gaiman. The Thames is a filthy beast. It winds through London like a blind worm or a sea serpent. All the rivers flow into it, the Fleet and the Tyburn and the Neckinger, carrying all the filth and scum and waste, the bodies of cats and dogs and the bones of sheep and pigs, down into the brown water of the Thames, which carries them east into the estuary, and from there into the North Sea and oblivion. It is raining in London. The rain washes the dirt into the gutters, and it swells streams into rivers into powerful things. The rain is a noisy thing, splashing and pattering and rattling the rooftops. If it is clean water as it falls from a sky, it only needs to touch London to become dirt, to stir dust and make it mud. Nobody drinks it, neither the rainwater nor the river water. They make jokes about Thames water killing you instantly, and it is not true. There are mudlarks who will dive deep for thrown pennies, then come up again, spout the river water, shiver, and hold up their coins. They do not die, of course, or not of that, although there are no mudlarks over 15 years of age. The woman does not appear to care about the rain. She walks the Rotherhithe docks, as she has done for years, for decades. Nobody knows how many years, because nobody cares. She walks the docks, or she stares out to sea. She examines the ships as they bob at anchor. She must do something to keep body and soul from dissolving the partnership, but none of the folk of the dock have the foggiest idea what this could be. You take refuge from the deluge beneath a canvas awning put up by a sailmaker. You believe yourself to be alone under there, at first, for she is statue still and staring out across the water, even though there is nothing to be seen through the curtain of rain. The far side of the Thames has vanished. And then she sees you. She sees you, and she begins to talk. Not to you, oh no, but to the grey water that falls from the grey sky into the grey river. She says, "My son wanted to be a sailor." And you do not know what to reply, or how to reply. You would have to shout to make yourself heard over the roar of the rain. But she talks, and you listen. You discover yourself craning and straining to catch her words. "My son wanted to be a sailor. I told him not to go to sea. I'm your mother," I said. "The sea won't love you like I love you. She's cruel." But he said, "Oh, mother, I need to see the world. I need to see the sun rise in the tropics and watch the northern lights dance in the Arctic sky. And most of all, I need to make my fortune. And then when it's made, I will come back to you
and build you a house, and you will have servants, and we will dance, mother. Oh, how we will dance! And what would I do in a fancy house, I told him. You're a fool with your fine talk. I told him of his father, who never came back from the sea. Some said he was dead and lost overboard, while some swore blind they'd seen him running a whorehouse in Amsterdam. It's all the same. The sea took him. When he was 12 years old, my boy ran away, down to the docks, and he shipped on the first ship he found. To Flores, in the Azores, they told me. They're ships of ill omen, bad ships, and they gave them a lick of paint after each disaster, and a new name to fool the unwary. Sailors are superstitious. The word gets round. This ship was run aground by its captain, on orders of the owners, to defraud the insurers. And then, all mended and as good as new, it gets taken by pirates. And then it takes a shipment of blankets, and becomes a plague ship crewed by the dead. And only 3 men bring it into port in Harwich. My son had shipped on a storm cruise ship. It was on the homeward leg of the journey, with him bringing me his wages, for he was too young to have spent them on women and on grog like his father, that the storm hit. He was the smallest one in the lifeboat. They said they drew lots fairly, but I do not believe it. He was smaller than them. After 8 days adrift in the boat, they were so hungry. And if they did draw lots, they cheated. They gnawed his bones clean, one by one, and they gave them to his new mother, the sea. She shed no tears, and took them without a word. She's cruel. Some nights I wish he had not told me the truth. He could have lied. They gave my boy's bones to the sea, but the ship's mate, who had known my husband, and known me true, better than my husband thought he did, if truth were told. He kept a bone as a keepsake. When they got back to land, all of them swearing my boy was lost in the storm that sank the ship. He came in the night, and he told me the truth of it, and he gave me the bone for the love that had once been between us. I said, "You've done a bad thing, Jack. That was your son that you've eaten." The sea took him too that night. He walked into her with his pockets filled with stones, and he kept walking. He'd never learned to swim. And I put the bone on a chain to remember them both by, late at night, when the wind crashes the ocean waves and tumbles them into the sand, when the wind howls around the houses like a baby crying.
The rain is easing, and you think she is done, but now, for the first time, she looks at you, and appears to be about to say something. She has pulled something from around her neck, and now she is reaching it out to you.
"Here,"
she says. Her eyes, when they meet yours, are as brown as the Thames.
"Would you like to touch it?"
You want to pull it from her neck, to toss it into the river for the mudlarks to find or to lose. But instead you stumble out from under the canvas awning, and the water of the rain runs down your face like someone else's tears.
It is Friday, the 25th of October, and beginning to turn cold. I'll put the heating on before I go. I'm leaving in about half an hour. I've been building up to it all day. Kept telling myself that I'd leave any minute now and spend the day waiting in the airport. In the airport. But I always knew that I'd wait until this time, until the light was going. London is at its best in the autumn, and 4 o'clock is the autumn time. 4 o'clock is when autumn is. An eddy of leaves is turning hectically in the street outside my study window. Flecks of green and brown lively against the tarmac. Earlier the sky was clear and blue, bright white clouds periodically changing the light which fell into the room. But now that light is fading, painting everything with a layer of gray dust. Smaller, drier leaves are falling on the other side of the street, collecting in a drift around the metal fence in front of number 12. I'll remember this sight. I remember most things. Everything goes in and stays there, not tarnishing but bright like freshly cut glass. An attic of experience to remind me what it is I've lost. The years will soften with their own dust, but dust is never that hard to brush away. I'll post the keys back through the door, so you'll know there is no need to look for me. And a spare set's always useful. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this letter. I could print it out and put it somewhere, or take it with me and post it later. Or perhaps I should just leave it on the computer, hidden deep in a subfolder, leaving it to chance whether it will ever be discovered. But if I do that, then one of the children will find it first. And it's you I should be explaining this to, not Richard or Maddie. You to whom the primary apology is due. I can't explain in person, because there wouldn't be any point. Either you wouldn't believe me, or you would. Neither would change the facts or make them any better. In your heart of hearts, buried too firmly to ever reach conscious thought, you may already have begun to suspect. You've given no sign, but we've stopped communicating on those subtler levels, and I can't really tell you what you think anymore. Telling you what you in some sense already know would just make you reject it, and me. And where will we go from there? My desk is tidy. All of my outstanding work has been completed. All the bills are paid. I'm going to walk. Not all the way, just our part. Down to Oxford Street.
I'll cross the road in front of our house, then turn down that alley you've always been scared of. I can never remember what it's called, but I do remember an evening when you forgot your fear long enough for it to be rather interesting. Then off down Kentish Town Road, past the Woolworths and the Vulture's Perch pub, the mediocre sandwich bars, and that shop the size of a football pitch, which is filled with only spectacles. I remember ranting against the waste of space when you and I first met, and you finding it funny. I suppose the joke's grown old. It's not an especially lovely area, and Falkland Road is hardly Bel Air. But we lived here 15 years, and we've always liked it, haven't we? At least until the last couple of years, when it all started to curdle. When I realized what was going to happen. Before that, Kentish towns suited us well enough. We liked Café Renoir, where you could get a reasonable breakfast when the staff weren't feeling too cool to serve it to you. The Assembly House pub, with its wall-to-wall Victorian mirrors, and a comprehensive selection of Irish folk on the jukebox. The corner store, where they always know what we want before we ask for it. All of that. It was our place. I couldn't talk to you about it when it started, because of how it happened. Even if it had come about some other way, I would probably have kept silent. But the time I realized what it meant, there wasn't much I could do. I hope I'm right in thinking it's only the last 2 years, which have been strained, that you were happy until then. I've covered my tracks as well as I could, kept it hidden. So many little lies, all of them unsaid. It was actually 10 years ago, when we had only been in this house a few years, and the children were still young and ours. I'm sure you remember John and Susie's party, the one just after they'd moved into the new house. Or maybe not. It is just one of many after all. And perhaps it is only my mind in which it retains a peculiar luminosity. You just started working at Elders and Peterson, and weren't very keen on going out. You wanted a weekend with a clear head to tidy up the house, do some shopping, to hang out without a hangover. But we decided we ought to go, and I promised I wouldn't get too drunk. And you gave me that sweet, affectionate smile, which said you believed I'd try, but that you'd still move the aspirin to beside the bed. We engaged our dippy babysitter, spruced ourselves up, and went out hand in hand, feeling for once as if we were in our 20s again. I think we even splashed out in a cab. Nice house, in its way, though we both thought it was rather big for just the two of them. John was just getting successful around then, and the size of the property looked like some kind of a statement. We arrived early, having agreed we wouldn't stay too late, and stood talking in the kitchen with Susie as she chopped vegetables for the dip. She was wearing the Whistles dress, which you both owned, and you and I winked secretly to each other. After much deliberation, you were wearing something different. The brown jigsaw suit with earrings from Monsoon that looked like little leaves. You still have those earrings somewhere? I suppose you must, though I haven't seen you wearing them in a while. I looked for them this morning, thinking that you wouldn't miss them, and that I might take them with me, but they're buried somewhere. By 10, the house was full, and I was pretty drunk, talking hard and loud with John and Howard in the living room. I glanced around to check if you were having a good time, and saw you leaning back against a table, plastic cup of red wine hovering around your lips. You were listening to Jan bang on about something, a rubbish ex-boyfriend probably. With your other hand, you were fumbling in your bag for your cigarettes, wanting one pretty soon, but trying not to let Jan see you weren't giving her familiar tale of woe your full attention. You're wonderful like that. Always doing the right thing, and in the right way. Always eager to be good, and not just so that people would admire you, just because. You finally found your packet and offered it to Jan, and she took a cigarette and lit it without even pausing for breath, a particular skill of hers. As you raised your Zippo to light your own, you caught me looking at you. You gave me a tiny wink to let me know you'd seen me, an infinitesimal roll of the eyes, but not enough to derail Jan. Your hand crept up to tuck your hair behind your ear. You'd just had it cut, and only I knew you weren't sure about the shorter style. In that moment, I loved you so much. Felt both lucky and charmed. And then, just behind you, she walked into the room, and everything went wrong. Remember Auntie's kitchen? That West Indian cafe between Kentish Town and Camden? Whenever we passed it, we'd peer inside at the cheerful checked tablecloths and say to each other that we must try it some day. We never did. We were always on the way somewhere else, usually to Camden Market to munch on noodles and browse at furniture we couldn't afford. And it never made sense to stop. I don't even know if it's still there anymore. After we started going everywhere by car, we stopped noticing things like that. I'll check tonight on the way down into town, but either way it's too late. We should have done everything while we had the chance. You never know how much things may change. Then, over the crossroads and down past the site, where the big Sainsbury's used to be. I remember the first time we shopped there together. Christ. Must have been 25 years ago. Both of us discovering what the other liked to eat, giggling over the frozen goods, and getting home to discover that despite spending £40, we hadn't really bought a single proper meal. It's become a nest of bijou little shops now, but we never really took to them. We liked the way things were then. We started seeing each other. And there's a limit to how many little ceramic pots anyone can buy, I suppose. By coincidence, I ate my first new meal just round the back of Sainsbury's a week after the party. It was gone midnight, and I knew you'd be wondering where I was, but I was desperate. 4 days of the chills, of half-delirious hungers, of feeling nauseous every time I looked at food, yet knowing I needed something. A young girl in her early 20s, staggering slightly, having reeled out of the electric ballroom still baked on E. I know that because I could taste it in her blood. She noticed me in the empty street and giggled, and I suddenly knew what I needed. She didn't run away as I walked toward her. It only took a little. You and I went to Kentish Town Library one morning, quite soon after we'd got the first flat together. You were interested in finding out a little more about the area, and found a couple of books by the Camden Historical Society. We discovered that no one was very interested in Kentish Town, despite the fact it's actually older than Camden, and you were grumpy about that because we liked where we lived. But we found out some interesting snippets, like the fact that the area in front of Camden Town Tube Station, the part which juts out into the crossroads, had once housed a tiny jail and a stocks. Today the derelicts and drunks still collect there, as if there is something in that patch of ground which draws society's misfits and miscreants even now. I'll cross that area on my way down, avoiding one of those tramps who I think recognizes something in me, and may be one of us, and head off down Camden Road toward Mornington Crescent. I don't understand why it happened. You and I loved each other, we had the kids, and had just finished redecorating. We were happy. There was no reason for what I did, no sense to it, no excuse, unless there was something about her which simply drew me. But why me and not someone else? She was very tall. She was very tall and extremely slim. She had short blonde hair and nothing in her head except cheekbones. She came into the room alone, and John immediately signaled to her. Drunkenly he introduced her to Howard and I, telling us her name was Vanessa, and that she worked in publishing. I caught you glancing over, and then looking away again, unconcerned. John burbled. He burbled on at us for a while about some project or other he was working on, and then set off for more drinks, pulling Howard in his wake. But then I was pretty drunk, still able to function on the level of, what do you do, blah, this is what I do, blah. I talked with Vanessa for a while. She had very blue eyes, a little curl of hair in front of each ear, and the way her neck met her shoulders was pleasing. That was all I noticed. She wasn't really my type. After 10 minutes, she darted to one side to greet someone else, a noisy drum of squeals and cheek kisses. No great loss. I've never found publishing interesting. I revolved slowly about the vertical plane until I saw someone I knew, and then went and talked to them. This person was an old friend I hadn't seen in some time, Roger, the one who got divorced last year, and the conversation took a while and involved several drinks. As I was returning from fetching one of those, I noticed the Vanessa woman standing in the corner holding a bottle of wine by the neck and listening patiently to someone complaining about babysitters. I suffered a brief moment of disquiet about ours. We suspected her of knowing where our stash of elderly dope was, and then made myself forget about it. When you're 30, all your friends can talk about are houses and marriage. By a few years later, babies and their sitters become the talk of the town. It's as if everyone collectively forgets that there's a real world out there with interesting things in it, and becomes progressively more obsessed with what happens behind their own front doors. I muttered something to this effect to Roger, glancing back across the corner. As I did so, the woman was swigging wine straight from the bottle, her body curved into a swan's neck of relaxed poise. I couldn't help wondering why she was here alone. Someone like that had to have a boyfriend. Then I noticed that she was looking at me, the mouth of the bottle an inch from her wet lips. I smiled, certainly. We never really spent much time in Mornington Crescent. Nothing to take us there, I suppose. Not even really a proper district as much. Such a... Not even really a proper district as such, more a blur between Camden and the top of Tottenham Court Road. I remember once, when Maddie was small, telling her that the red two-story building we were driving past had been once a station like Kentish towns, and that in fact there were many other disused stations dotted over London. Mornington Crescent Tube was shut and supposed to be renovated, but I told Maddie I didn't believe them. She didn't believe me at first, but I showed her an old map, and after she was always fascinated by the idea of abandoned stations. York Road, Down Street, and South Kentish Town, which you can see when you pass it underground, if you know when to look. Places which had once meant something to the people who lived there, and which were now nothing but scar tissue in a city that had moved forward in time. Mornington Crescent opened again in time, proving me wrong and providing both of us with a lesson in parental fallibility. Then down toward the Euston Road, the part of the walk you never liked. It's a bit boring, I'll admit. Nothing but towering council blocks and busy roads. And by then you'd be complaining about your feet. But I'll walk it anyway. It's part of the trip. And by the time I come back, it will all have changed. Maybe it'll be less boring. But it won't be the same. One in the morning. The party was going strong. Had, if anything, surged up to a new level. I saw that you were still okay, sitting cross-legged on the floor in the living room and happily arguing with Susie about something. By then I was very drunk, and on something like my 7 billionth trip to the toilet. I reached down with my hand as I passed you, and you squeezed it for a moment. Then I flailed up 2 flights to the nearest unoccupied bathroom, cursing John for having so many stairs. The top floor of the house was darker than the rest, but I'd worn a channel in the new carpet by then and found my way easily enough. Afterward, I washed my hands with expensive soap for a while, standing weaving in front of the mirror, giggling at my reflection and chuntering cheerfully at myself. Back outside again, and I seemed to have got more drunk. I tripped down the small flight of steps which led to the landing, and reached out to steady myself. Suddenly my mouth was filled with saliva, and I had a horrible suspicion I was about to christen the house. But a minute of deep breathing and compulsive swallowing convinced me I'd survived to drink another drink. I heard a rustling sound and turned to peer through a nearby doorway. I recognized the room. It was one John had shown us earlier, destined to become his study. "Where you'll sit becoming more and more successful," I thought churlishly to myself. I think in a different voice. At that stage, it didn't seem very likely he would commit suicide 6 years later. "Hello," she said. The woman called Vanessa was standing in the empty room, over by the window. Cold moonlight made her features look as if they'd been molded in glass, but whoever had done it must have been pretty good. Without really knowing why, I stumbled into the room, pulling the door shut behind me. As she walked toward me, her dress rustled again, the sound like a shiver of leaves outside a window in the night. We met in the middle. I don't remember her pulling her dress up, just the long white stretch of her thighs. I don't remember undoing my trousers, but someone must have done. All I remember is saying, "But you must have a boyfriend," and her just smiling at me. It was insane. Someone could have come in at any moment, but it happened. Tottenham Court Road, home of cut-price technology, and recipient of many an impulse buy on my part. When we walked down it toward Oxford Street, you used to grab my arm and try to pull me past the stores, or throw yourself in front of the window displays to hide them from me. Then later I'd end up standing in Marks and Spencer for hours, while you dithered over underwear. I moaned and said it was unfair, but I didn't really mind. Past the Time Out building, where Howard used to work, and then the walk will be over. At the junction of Oxford Street and Tottenham Court Road, I'll turn around and look back the way I've come and say goodbye to it all. Sentimental, perhaps, but that walk means a lot to me. Then I'll go down into Oxford Street Tube and sit on the Piccadilly line to Heathrow. I have a ticket, my passport, and some dollars, but not very many. I'm going to have to find a way of earning more sooner or later, so it may as well be sooner. I've left the rest of our money for you. If you're stuck for a present for Maddie's birthday, I've heard her mention the new Asylum Fields album a couple times. Though probably she'll have bought it herself, I suppose. I keep forgetting how old they've gotten. After those 10 minutes in John's study, I came downstairs again, suddenly shocked into sobriety. You were sitting exactly where I had left you, but it felt like everything else in the world had changed. I was terrified that you'd read something from my face, realize what I had done. But you just reached up and yanked me down to sit next to you. Everybody smiled, apparently glad to see me. Howard passed a joint. My friends and I felt like you didn't deserve them. Or you. Especially not you. We left an hour later. I sat a little apart from you in the cab, convinced you'd smell Vanessa on me. But I clutched your hand and you seemed happy enough. We got home, and I had a shower while you clanked around in the kitchen making tea. Then we went to bed, and I held you tightly until you drifted off. I stared at the ceiling for an hour, chilled with self-loathing, and then surprised myself by falling asleep. Within a few days I was calmer. A drunken mistake. These things happen. I elected not to tell you about it, partly through self-serving cowardice, but more out of a genuine knowledge of how little it meant, and how much it would hurt you to know. The ratio between the two was steep, too steep for me to say anything. After a fortnight it had sunk to the level of vague memory, the only lasting effect an increased realization of how much I wanted to be with you. That was the only time in all our years together that anything like that happened, I promise you. It should all have been okay. A cautionary lesson learned. But then the first hunger pangs came and everything changed for me. If anything, I feel lucky that we've had 10 years, that I was able to hide it for that long. I developed the habit of occasional solitary walks in the evening, a cover that no one seemed to question. I started going to the gym and eating healthily, and maybe that also helped to hide what was happening. At first you didn't notice, and then I think you're even a little proud that your husband was staying in such a good shape. But a couple years ago, that pride faded. Around about the time the kids started looking at me curiously. Not very often, and maybe not very consciously, But just as you started making unflattering remarks about your figure, how your body was not lasting out compared to mine, I think at some level the children noticed something too. Maddie had always been Daddy's girl. You said so yourself. She isn't anymore. And I don't think that's just because she's growing up and going out with that dickhead. She's uncomfortable with me. Richard's overly polite too these days. And so are you. It's like I've done something which none of us can remember, something small which nonetheless set me apart from you, as if we're all tiptoeing carefully around something we don't understand. You'll work out some consensus among you. An affair. Depression. Something. I know you all care for me, and that it won't be easy. But it has to be this way. I'm not telling you where I'm going. It won't be one of the places we've been on holiday together, that's for sure. The memories would hurt too much. After a while, a new identity. And then a new life, for what it's worth. New places, new things, new people. And none of them will be you. I've never seen Vanessa since that night, incidentally. If anything, what I feel for her is hate. Not even for what she did to me. For that little bite disguised as passion. More just because, on that night 10 years ago, I did something small and normal and stupid which would have hurt you had you known. The kind of mistake anyone can make, not just people like me. I regret that more than anything. The last human mistake I made. On the last night, I was still your husband and nothing else. That I was unfaithful to the only woman I've ever really loved. It was someone who didn't matter to me, and who only did it because she had to. I knew she must have had a boyfriend. I just didn't realize what kind of man he would be. I can't send this letter, can I? Not now. And probably not even later. Perhaps it's been nothing more than an attempt to make myself feel better. A selfish confession for my own peace of mind. But I've been thinking of you while I've been writing it. So in that sense, at least, it is written to you. Maybe I'll find some way of keeping track of your lives and send this when you're near the end. When it won't matter so much. And you may be asking yourself what exactly it was that happened. But probably that's not fair either. And by then you won't want to know. Perhaps if I'd told you earlier, when things were still good between us, we could have worked out a way of dealing with it. It's too late now. It's nearly 4 o'clock. I'll come back someday when it's safe, when no one could recognize me as still alive. It will be a long wait, but I will come. That day's already planned. I'll start walking at Oxford Street, walk all the way back up, seeing what remains and what has changed. That distance, at least, will stay the same, and maybe I'll be able to pretend you're walking it with me, taking me home again. I could point out the differences, and we'd remember the way it was. And maybe, if I can recall it clearly enough, it will be like I never went away. But I'll reach Falkland Road eventually, and stand outside looking up at this window, not knowing who lives here now, only that it isn't us. Perhaps if I shut my eyes, I'll be able to hear your voice. Imagine you sitting inside. Conjure up the life that could have been. I hope so. And I will always love you. But it's time to go. I did not say who that was by. Just a moment. That was Dear Allison by Michael Marshall Smith. And now we move on. Let's see. Let me see here now what we got going on. I was hoping for more dialogue. Just a little bit. Well, you want to do it? Hell from the East by Hugh Howey. The Free Territory of Colorado, 1868. My path to sickness began the day General Lee surrendered his sword. That coward laid down his arms, and so me and my brother took our rifles and headed west. Wasn't sure where we was heading, just away. My brother didn't make it far. He survived the Battle of Sharpsburg, was brought down by a persistent cough. Fell off his horse and never got back up. I'd seen more dead than any vicar, but that don't make me immune to its sad effects. Many a drink and several fistfights later, I found myself in a new army. They gave me a uniform I was familiar shooting at, more than buttoning across my chest, and somehow slid from a war between brothers to this frontier life, hunting natives. It was all about killing a man you didn't know. That made it easier. Keeping them strangers. Knowing them makes the killing hard. My father had raised me and my brothers in the pine-studded hills of Virginia, just outside of Staunton. Pa gave me my first rifle, pointed at a squirrel, told me to shoot. Men more dear to me than my father have been handing me guns and directing my fire ever since. I still find it strange how a man can lose at a war and then enlist in another with his enemy. But there are no real sides in this life except the barrel of a gun and the butt of a gun. And I know where I prefer to stand. After enlisting, they stationed me at Fort Morgan. This was years before that unfortunate incident at Wounded Knee Creek. It was before the world heard of the ghost dance that was driving the natives mad. What we would one day call the Messiah craze, and would lodge in my ear like a starving tick, had yet to cause trouble on those plains. Fort Morgan was a lot like the endless Confederate encampments I had endured while serving. The only difference was that the fort didn't relocate in the morning. I had far fewer men moaning and dying in tents, and I was less prone to abandonment at night. I reckon Colorado was a long way for a man to run home from. Most soldiers out there had already done their running, and Fort Morgan was where they'd ended up. Their final resting spot was a scrabble of tents and rickety shacks, ringed by a shoddy wall of pine stumps, where the best they could be said was they fed you twice a day. Two muddy tracks came in straight as an arrow from the east, cut right through Fort Morgan, disappeared out the other end toward the west. In one direction, flat nothing where only the dust stirred and a creek petered out and was swallowed by the cracked earth. In the other, ancient and impossibly tall mountains stood with the white tops like old men. The hell in between was our home. In the spring and all through the summer, when the gray brows on those granite men to the west receded with the melts and the creek raged, an endless caravan of poor people with rich dreams appeared along the twin-rutted road from territories east. They passed through on their way to California, and our sworn duty at Fort Morgan was to see that their scalps moved right along with them. Those were the melts in the busy months, spring and summer. Autumn and winter were a harder time at the fort. Men took to cards and more drink than the good army allowed, and each of us spent our share of nights in the pen sobering up, feeling like asses for mistakes we barely remembered. Those were the hard months, and in the 1868th year of our Lord, they got suddenly harder. I was out with Private Collins, taking in a pair of deer, when Lieutenant Randall took the sickness. The lieutenant had been away from the fort for near on 8 weeks. A trail scout, he spent most of his time up in the hills, living in a tent like a native, looking for less damnable passages between those brutish mountains. He was always a bit peculiar, but nothing to presage, or how do they say that? Presage? Nothing to presage him, wandering back into camp and murdering 5 good men in cold blood. Yet that's just what he did. 4 of his fellow enlisted men were shot dead, plus a half-Indian cook named Sammy. Randall shot each of them in the head before one managed to wing him, put an end to the slaughter. Why they didn't kill him on the spot, I will never know. Private Collins and me returned from our hunt too late to help with anything but the digging. Saw the aftermath, though. Brains and skull and hair that took me right back to the war. They was already mopping it up, so we were handed shovels. Now, nobody's consulted me for my legal expertise, but justice would have been served by shooting Lieutenant Randall right there on the spot. But the good army of the United States of America had its own sense of justice. There are trials and spectacles afforded a man before his chest is riddled by a firing squad. There are nights spent in the pen, which is how I found myself nursing a blister from the shoveling, sitting there on a hard bench outside the holding cell, taking my shift at watching Lieutenant Randall so that he weren't shot dead by some enterprising fellow before dawn. On the bench across from me was my hunting partner and shovel mate, Private Collins. I surmised that his presence was to make sure I didn't scratch that itch of justice either. I was keeping an eye on him and he on me, and both of us on the lieutenant. Randall, meanwhile, snored and babbled like only the guilty and outright crazy could manage on the eve of the probable execution. What could make a man break camp one morning riding to shoot his comrades in their skulls? Morbid curiosity had me itching to know. I tried to discern some of what he was saying in his sleep. Couldn't make out a word. "That's red talk," Collins told me. I turned to the private and realized I'd been leaning forward on my bench, my face scrunched up in concentration. I tried to relax. "You understand what he's mumbling?" I asked, keeping my voice down. Collins chewed on the end of an unlit cheroot and then spat a dab of tobacco between our feet. "Arapaho," he said, matter-of-factly. Private Collins had that air about him, that supreme confidence that got on some men's nerves. He'd also bagged both deer that morning, firing before I had the chance. Still, I liked him. "What's he saying?" I asked. The only Indian I recognized was their war cries, when the hair on my back of my neck was translation enough. Collins shrugged, sucked on his cigar. "You should take an Arapaho whore and mason," he said. "I know what their language sounds like. Can catch a few words, but unless he starts talking about how thick my member is." He smiled, and not for the first time. I wonder why I like this man, yet despise so many others. "Why the hell is he dreaming in Arapaho?" I asked, still whispering. It was strange that I wanted the man in that pen dead, but cared not to disturb his sleep. Collins turned toward the dimly lit cell. "Reckon he done gone native. Happens. Too much time up in the hills. Or maybe he's been heading into Mason, taking up with my whore." Collins laughed, but Randall didn't stir. I settled back on my bench and marveled at a man who could sleep through that, through what might have been the last night of his life. More than justice, I was thirsty for answers. I decided come morning I would ask the Major if Collins and I could go hunting for something up in those hills besides deer. Or squirrel. Oh, good goddamn, that's what that's lacking. Major Jack Lawson was a peculiar leader of men. part eccentric and part mountain man. He was the reason Fort Morgan had a grand piano and a small library, but no decent latrine. Music and books, and somehow shitting in bare holes in the dirt, were all apparently good for our souls. Turned out the Major was just as curious about Randall's sudden madness as we were. He gave us his blessing to ride out in search of clues. Collins knew where Randall had set up camp the previous autumn, and so we followed an angry stream up through the pines and aspens and cottonwoods, made up the scruff around the old mountain's neck. Stumbling on a native camp, it took a moment to realize that it was in fact Randall's place. An army-issue tent lay draped across a lean-to of woven branches. A half-finished structure of limbs and sticks jutted up nearby, a rough circle with a tall pole in the center. Around the camp, every tree within 100 feet had been felled, the trunks radiating outward as though they'd been knocked over by a terrible blast. Gnawed stumps stood out everywhere. I noticed how cleanly they'd been hewn, not an errant strike to be seen, none of the work of a madman. "Took down enough trees for a second Morgan up here," I remarked. I peered inside Randall's abandoned tent, found nothing amiss. The bedroll was laid out like it expected to be slept in. A set of pots and cutlery innocently nestled in one corner. Smelled of leather and sweat and man, even with the air cold enough to fog my breath. Collins poked a smoldering log in the fire pit with a stick and was rewarded with a flight of embers, like bees startling from a hive. "Don't think he was after the timber," Collins said. He left the pit alone and headed past the tent to the half-completed structure that had made me think this was an Indian campsite. Shielding his eyes, he glanced up at the autumn sky. "I reckon he was out to fill the shade, is what." I looked up as well. The morning sun slid shyly behind a bank of clouds. "Fill the shade?" I asked. "It's a sun hut." Collins waved his arm. "They dance in it. The Arapaho do." There was a loud snap in the woods. We both turned toward the sound. There was a flash of white as a deer bounded away from us and through the cottonwoods. I turned to Collins, who I suspected knew more of the Arapaho than the moans of a Mason whore. "What kind of dance?" Collins watched the deer a moment longer, then scanned the woods. Finally, he turned to the odd structure, whose walls curved upward like an unfinished dome. A pole sat in the center that I figured was bound to support an arching roof. But I would find out later that the hut was finished just as it stood. "All I know is what little I've heard. Pretty sure it started with the Arapaho, but other tribes have taken part, spreading like those damn Mormons, like some kind of religion." Collins pointed to the sky. "They dance around the pole, stare up at the sun for days. They see things, hear voices, and then they probably get drunk on peyote and shove feathers up their arses for all I know." He shrugged and pulled out his cheroot. To my amazement, Collins bent and grabbed up a smoking fag from the fire and lit the thing with noisy puffs. Maybe he figured we'd already chased away the deer, and to hell with the smoke. Or maybe he'd seen enough death the day before to stop saving the thing for tomorrow. Or perhaps the talk of ghosts and whispers had stirred his nerves. I watched his white exhalations rise toward the clouds, and the sun reemerged to peer down at us. Well, I guess you're right, I told Collins. He raised an eyebrow, threw the fag back in the fire. I think Lieutenant Randall is done and gone native. Maybe fell for some squall. Started seeing us as the enemy. The private pinched something off the end of his tongue and inspected it. Maybe, he said, but it sounded like he doubted it. He smoked his cheroot like it would be the last and studied the sky as if the sun up there knew something neither of us did. The two of us shared our findings with the major later that morning, handed over Randall's tent, bedroll, and mess kit. Collins drew a straw for the firing squad. I did not. The both of us had missed the court-martial, which hadn't taken long. 3 witnesses said he did it, and Randall hadn't uttered a word of defense. We heard he stared at the ceiling the entire time before being led back to the pen. I should have gotten some sleep before lunch. Only had a few hours the night before. But I volunteered to ride out with some others to see about another rustling. Strange disappearance of cattle from a rancher to the east. On the ride out, I sidled my horse next to John McCall's. McCall had grown up in the Arizona territory, had missed the war entirely, and knew about as much as Indians as any of us. He used to keep a feather stuck in his cap until a major told him to lose it. When pressed, McCall admitted he'd heard of the Sundance. He was surprised to hear about the hunt near Randall's tent. Said he thought it must have already been there. I told him about the felled trees. McCall didn't have much to say after that. We rode along in silence, the sun beating down on us, the horses growing warm, the featureless landscape marking it, making it feel like we'd hardly moved. While the others went to talk to the rancher about his missing cattle and the burn marks some lightning strikes had left in the grass, I rode the fence line looking for a break in the thorny wire. I was sure the rancher had already checked his fence, but in my experience, the most likely culprit to make off with a few head of cattle were those few head of cattle. I expected to see them milling about on the side of the trail where the grass grew tallest. It was getting on noon. The flies buzzed something fierce. Amazing it could be cool in the morning up in the hills. So damn hot come afternoon on the plains. My mouth was dry and tasted of the dirt kicked up by my horse. Shaking my canteen, I decided to take it easy on the water. Before long, I found a drooping wire in the fence and dismounted to take a closer look. It was only the top wire amiss. A sprightly cow might make the jump, but unlikely. Wiping my neck, I glanced up accusingly at the high sun. Not a cloud in the sky. I remembered something I'd learned early on in Kansas. There are tribes who would only come at you in the morning from the east. They would ride in, and you couldn't see their arrows in the glare. Before they attacked, one of their scouts would sit on the hill every morning,
high on his horse, feathers blazing. It would be as good as invisible. Ghosts, bringing hell from the east. They'd keep an eye on their enemy until it was time to rain death. Devious sons of bitches. Ah, hell. The sun shone bright that day as I scanned the sky. And finally, I had to look away. I didn't believe what Collins and McCall had said about dancing around and looking up at that fiery beast. A man couldn't stand 2 seconds staring at it. Maybe I was delirious from lack of sleep, or thinking about a man I had known who was at that moment being shot in the chest by my compadres. Or maybe it was the sight of those that I'd buried the day before. Or I was just being powerfully curious and not thinking straight. But I felt an ungodly tug. So I looked up and tried to return the gaze of that great yellow monster in the wide blue sky. The burn was intense and immediate. It made my brain hurt somewhere deep between my brows. The squinting was involuntary. My horse made a sound and pawed at the air with one hoof. "Steady now," I told him, taking the reins and turning away, unable to take it any longer. Blinking tears, I could see a green image in my vision, a disc the color of fresh grass. I wondered if this was what they claimed to see, those who danced and saw what weren't there. The wire fence drooped like it was melting in the sun. A faint wind blew dust across my boots. Back toward the fort, mountains rose from the flat desert, impossibly tall, the white on their tops growing with the cold months. I blinked and wondered what in the hell I was doing out there. How could anyone dance around for 3 days and stare at the sun? Determined, I gave it another try. I'd go for the count of 20. Pain be damned. If an Arapaho could do it, so could I. Throwing my head back, I squinted at the sun and met it like a man. Again, the feeling was like claws raking my eyeballs. There was a primitive urge to look away, like a thumb on a hot pan. I forced my eyes open wider, muscles in my face quivering in complaint, tears streaking down my cheeks. I lost count. I swayed, my balance funny, and I reached for a fence post to steady myself. As my horse clumped down the road, I ignored him. There was nothing but white and heat, both penetrating straight into my brain. I hopped in place and cursed nothing in particular, just said shit and damn while the tears streamed on out. But no bright light was stronger than this Virginia boy. Oh, I'd had to gone to a count of 20, but I decided to keep going a bit more. I had the water in the canteen, could dump that in my eyes after, and put the fire out. There was no thought of going blind. That fear would come later. I was just enduring the pain because, God damn it, I wasn't going to let it beat me. My neck cramped up. Now something had taken hold of me. Some wild thought that this was not the right... some wild thought that this was the right thing to do. To stare at the sun as long as I was able. Releasing the post, I drifted around in circles there in the dirt, admiring the shapes and colors as they spun in my vision. I saw purple. I saw strangers swim through the sky. When my lids clamped down involuntarily, I used my fingers to pry them open again. The burn and pain went straight through me, till it felt like an itch being scratched. I spun and spun, felt the barbed wire catch at my trousers. The fence would keep me in. I thought of Collins spinning around his little Indian hut. The barbs were suddenly those sticks poking at me, corralling me. The light shone right through my eyes, down to the base of my skull, and deep into my neck where words are formed. My face grew warm, but now the bright light was cool as it swam through me. I could hear myself laugh. The horse drew away further, and I cared little. When the vision came, it was a thunderclap, a sudden roar. Though I realized the words had been there before, they were the buzzing in my brain, nonsense words. But I knew what they meant. I saw them like shapes and things, like swirling dreams. There was shouting, someone on the road with me, a man with my own voice, crying and crying. Fingers pinned my eyes open. I never want to look away from the sun again. Oh, I loved it in that instant. I wanted it to fall out of the sky and enter me through my eyeballs. I wanted to let it blow me across the prairie and set everything on fire, to burn that land ahead of its coming, to make room. I saw men and women and children fall before me. I saw an infant thrown into the flames, blood in everyone's eyes, and the voices, these words foreign and understood that came like pictures directly into my head. This voice on the road that spoke as I spun and spun between the barbed wire and my skittish horse. They sounded like the tongue of a red man. I woke up and men were dead. My men. Something told me there had been a killing. My head throbbed like my heart was trapped in my skull. It swollen up and needed out. Took a moment to realize my eyes were open, but I wasn't seeing anything. I could barely make out a shape in front of my face when I waved my hand before it. Groping about, I felt a bunk beneath me, a wall of steel bars behind. I was in the pen. I could feel the firing squad lined up, instruments of death aimed at my chest. Could see the men I'd killed.
Sir, he's done stirred.
Voices and shuffling feet. I had Arapaho on my tongue. Taste of silver and fire. Words like pictures drawn in the dirt, telling me what to do. Something alien had communicated with me. A part of it lived deep inside.
Drink some water, son.
There was a hand on my wrist. A hand reaching through the bars. A tin of water was pressed into my palm, sloshing cool on my forearm. My lips stung as I drank. I pulled the cup away and touched my mouth. Found my lips swollen, cracked. My throat burned. But the horrible throbbing in my eyes and my brain drowned out these lesser hurts.
What the hell happened to you?
Major. My voice was a pale shadow of its old self. I drank more, ignoring the sting of my fouled lips. What did I do? I asked.
Well, they found you face up in the dirt, babbling like you had had a few too many. Your horse came back to the fort without you.
I can't see.
That's what you've been saying. Doc said to put you in here where it was dark, that it should come back. You rest up, okay? Can't afford to lose any more of my men.
How many?
I could hear the boards creak as the major shifted his weight.
How many what, son?
Did I? How many dead?
Memories and visions were mixed up in my head. Words I knew and words I didn't. There were flashes of green and swimming lights in my eyes like an angry campfire. Something was telling me to kill, or that I already had. Hard to tell which.
Get some rest. I'll send some food over.
I nursed my water and decided I hadn't done the things I thought I had. But I could feel the urge. Some silent screaming beneath my skin. Something directing my bones. I was reminded of a visit to Richmond when I was a boy. A friend of my mother's was a pastor there. Took us to this great big church. There was a belfry terribly high off the ground. A circuit of rickety stairs. And at one corner you could peer down at the street like a bird. Something in me felt this urge to jump down and go plummeting down. Something so strong that I had to back away and clutch my father. Even though I was too old to be holding his hand. And now this demon was in my blood again. This time to hurt others. Long after the tin cup was dry, I continued to pass it back and forth between my hands. It was Collins who brought me my supper.
You gone and blinded yourself,
Collins said, a voice in the darkness. Hinges peeled as he let himself into the pen, and I realized the door had never been locked. I hadn't killed no man, not that day anyhow. The plate was warm as he rested it on my knee. A fork was pressed into my palm.
You manage all right?
He asked.
See anything yet?
I shook my head. I saw things, but not like he meant.
I blame myself,
Collins said.
but what was you thinking?
I weren't, I admitted. Just started and couldn't stop. Collins laughed.
I most take a glance in and know it's a bad idea.
I groped around the plate with my fork, found some resistance, some weight, took a sniff of potatoes, blew on them in case it was hot. How anyone lived with such blindness I couldn't fathom. I heard voices, I told Collins. I wasn't sure I'd ever tell anyone, but it just came out. Voices, and I had a vision. I swallowed the potatoes and shook my head. Patches of murk swam in the darkness, a vague discernment of shapes. I'd welcome just seeing my own hands.
You heard voices? You mean when they scooped you off the road?
Before, I peered at where I thought Collins stood, where I heard him. They were telling me to do awful things. I think Randall was poisoned by the sun.
Randall was poisoned by the Arapaho. He was babbling that nonsense right up until we shot him. You just need some sleep is all.
I nodded and ate. Collins gave me silent and invisible company. By nightfall, felt as though some of my eyesight was returning, but not much. I fell asleep on that cot for drunkards, madmen, and murderers, and wondered which one of them I was. When I awoke, it was not yet dawn. My internal clock had unwound from the late shifts and lack of sleep. But I could see my hands, and my lips only part ways stuck together. Groping about, I let myself out of the pen and sought my own bunk. Along the way, with my fingers brushing cedar clapboards to keep from spinning in circles, I noticed the pinpricks of tiny lights in my vision. It was pitch black across the fort, and it was like somehow the brightness of stars were able to penetrate my blindness. But no, it was my eyesight returning. I stopped and marveled at the tiny spots of light in that infinite darkness. The voices were out there, straining to be heard. There was a madness in my soul, an invader. It hadn't taken a full hold of me, but its claws left marks. It was the same madness I'd seen in the war cries of the natives we fought with. It was the madness Randall had seized upon. A cry from some distant throat telling me that this land was someone else's and that a reckoning was coming. That was the sight I'd seen. A land wiped clean and taken by those who didn't belong. A land of dead and missing cattle, starve us the way we'd done with the buffalo. A time of great sickness and men dying beyond counting, with infection rained down from the heavens like some poison blanket. This was the calling. I heard it clearer that night than I ever would again. I stood there for what felt like hours, searching for those pinprick stars, marveling at how our own sun was said to be like one of them. Our sun, where native tribes stood sentinel in the morning, so we couldn't see them coming, where they would watch and plan their deadly raids. Many a time they had brought hell on us from the east, with the rising of the sun. The Arapaho and the Sioux and the Apache. But I reckon we'd done the same, and that others might do it to us one day. Generations back, a man with my name had crossed a wide sea and brought his own hell from the east. Others would come. It were folly to think we'd be the last. That was my vision. What I saw clearly that night in my blindness, and with an ear full of strange voices. I saw the night and its lights like never before. There was a far and dark sea out there, hanging over me. A dark sea that ships sailed on, scouts arriving at dawn to watch over us, vast fleets to rain down by dusk. But it was not yet dusk. It was early yet. And those stars were like campfires, impossibly distant, where strange men spoke in strange tongues and conjured war. They spoke with words that I could not fathom, but could see like scratches in the dirt, could see like a calling to do bad things on their behalf. I tried to explain this to whoever would listen, but they would only lock me up for my troubles. They'd lock me up before I ever got the chance to heed those voices the way Lieutenant Randall had. I was locked up years later, and therefore not a part of that massacre at Wounded Knee Creek, which put an end to the war with our red kin. I was locked up while more cattle went missing, and a great sickness swept the land. Millions and millions of people dying like my brother had. It has not yet come, this thing from the east that whispers for me to clear the land in preparation. It has not yet come. Something stirs, and will talk to those crazy enough to look and listen. There's something across that dark sea, across that expanse of space, that men saner than me say no one will ever cross. But I'll wager my red brother thought the same thing in the deep blue Atlantic that lapped their former shores. And here we are. We who hailed from the east, who came from that rising sun too bright to see, who came first with scouts across the pitch black, standing tall and ignorant and proud, atop some deadly ridge. That was Hail from the East by Hugh Howey. Howey, in case you want to look it up. Y'all have a good night.